I noticed when I sat down to read, I was all of a sudden very tired. Yawning again. But when caught up in staring at Facebook, YouTube, flipping through things, like screens, um, I don't feel tired at all. I just keep going and going and going. I noticed while reading those last two sections that I was reactive to them. In the first reading, I felt, I know all of this and this is tedious. I'm way beyond this. The right view stuff and the like, oh, if you think you're right all the time and you get angry about other people's viewpoints, I learned that years ago. However, even when we learn something, we have to apply it, become skillful at applying it. Um, it's actually kind of dangerous to know something. I've always differentiated between knowing something and understanding something. And this whole period of reflection is giving me another level of differentiation to make, that there's knowing something, which is where you like realize something or read about something or have some kind of insight. And understanding is something when it becomes really internalized. Like you not just know it. I've sometimes known things for like a decade or something before I understand it. And understanding is like a blossoming. It just where I'm like, oh, and all of a sudden I understand how this applies to everything in my life, and I understand where it comes from and how other people relate to it. So understanding is much more powerful than knowing. But I'm seeing now, which may sound silly, this third level of skillful application, because life is something that we are living. That it's not just something we are thinking about, or writing about, or talking about, or understanding internally. It's something we are living. And therefore, there is an important aspect of skillful application. And one might even say skillful habituation, which is also called training, I think, in this context. So, when I did the meditation retreat 6 weeks ago, whenever it was now, I remember feeling very embarrassed. When I had a heartbreak last year, I felt very embarrassed. When I find more clear, multi-dimensional understandings of things that I knew, but how they actually apply to my life and reality and other people's lives, I feel embarrassed for being stupid or naive or ignorant, blind. But it happens frequently to me. It happens frequently to me. It has my whole life that I can see things and understand them on like fine differentiated planes, and I can understand them perhaps with a wide breadth, but on fine differentiated planes that aren't necessarily integrated into my life as a whole, or to general consensus reality, or social interactions, or personal relationships, romantic relationships, family relationships, friend relationships. And whenever I notice that there's been these discrete differentiations of understanding on separate planes that are not integrated, I feel embarrassed because I assume that, of course, everyone else knows this already, which is not true, because I've time and time and time again found that a lot of people, well, I find either that people do not understand these revelations that I have, or that other spiritual people have, or books talk about, or prophets talk about, or whatever. I find that either people do not understand these, or what I often find my mind doing is believing that they understand them so intrinsically that they are just not an issue, and that I am an idiot for bringing it up. I used to feel like it was a crime to talk about understandings of the function of reality, that I would somehow be in trouble, that I was somehow violating some law of the universe. We don't talk about that. One of the things I like about Buddhism is how flatly, bluntly, frankly, they talk about the workings of existence. Because I've almost always felt like that's inappropriate. And yet it's always been a gigantic area of interest for me, because I've always felt so confused, confounded by existence. Like, what the fuck am I doing here? I don't want any of this. And then I get caught up in it, of course, and just confused by it. Which unfolds into two other things that I'm reflecting on about tonight's reading. One of them is the dogma. Constantly she's saying right view, and if you practice right view long enough, then you get absolute right view, and if you're empty out your vessel enough, then you fill it with the Dhamma, and then you expound the Dhamma. And it's the exact same thing as evangelical Christian stuff, where it's just like there's only one way of truly seeing everything, and if you do everything the right way, then you will become the right way, and you will become the mouth of God, and then everything will be great. Whatever. Or it won't matter. It won't matter anymore, because everything will be better in another world. And it feels horrible to me. I don't like it at all. I have disdain for it. I have an allergic reaction to it. I did say when I took the meditation retreat before that it was so painful to me the first few days. It was as if I were a vampire in the sunlight, which can, of course, metaphorically relate to the light of enlightenment, or the light of the truth, or whatever the fuck, shining on my delusional, crazy being, whatever, damaged, sick, dirty, impure, whatever, are the logical imperatives that, necessitate purifying oneself through ascetic means. So I find I'm super reactionary against that. It feels really uncomfortable to me. I think of people that I've known in my life, and how they would also just be like, what? Even people I know who have given up alcohol and drugs, or never liked them, would still probably balk a bit at the villainization of sensuality, or the villainization of the ego, which has always been a big problem for me, in that I've always believed the ego is, a necessary organ of life. The body is our vehicle, it's our avatar here on this realm, and there is an and the ego is the specific operating system that can interact with this body. The body is an expression of a genetic code, which is a bio scripting of the history of not just the evolution, which it is, but also the integration of the disparate energies, which is one of the viewpoints that I have that I want to write a book about. The integration of the disparate energies that creates what we call humans, and the ego is the operating system that allows this is where words are clunky, the eternal soul, or the one, or the higher self, or the archetype. It depends what frame story you want to think in, and these are, again, words that I use that I don't know if they mean anything to people, but meaning that once you get, I mean, the material realm is endlessly fascinating, and you can differentiate it forever and ever and ever, but when you get outside of the material realm, then you can pop immediately to the everything nothing, Tao, yin yang, Bina, whatever term you want to, think of Brahma. You can just directly go to, go, where there is nothing and everything, and that anything that exists is the one, the expression of everything. And in the background, that everything is being projected on is the nothing. And so we are all basically this expression of being, which is everything, through an ego. However, I also believe that there are endless, let's just say, endless frame stories. There's an Aristotelian view of the universe that is now outmoded and not talked about anymore, but I read about it in a book by John Crowley. It's actually, you can see it behind me over my shoulder, Demonomania. I don't know if it was in Demonomania or Love and Sleep or Egypt, The Solitudes, but it was in one of those three. But in Aristotelian, it was useful to me because it was one of the ways that Western civilization made sense of why astrology meant anything. For those of you who are interested in that kind of thing, why it means something, or if you're interested in it and believe that it means something, and you might not have heard the story, that in the Aristotelian view of the universe, the Earth was a fixed surface, I believe flat, round disc on 4 pillars, standing in the firmament. And there was a sphere around it, that the moon was embedded in, a crystal sphere, clear, and the moon was embedded in the sphere. And outside of that, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the stars, each in their own sphere, nesting inside. So the Earth was at the center, and then there was sphere. Crystal spheres, clear, with the movable planets, the movable stars, fixed in the spheres, and the immovable stars, they called it, on the outside. And outside of all these crystal spheres, because the last crystal sphere was the last crystal sphere was the immovable stars, and which I guess was where the constellations were and all the others. And outside of all that was God pushing this mechanism. And it spun and spun and spun. And so, of course, people were obsessed with the idea of building orreries and representations of this thing. But what's interesting about that is that when a person comes into existence, that is to say, getting born, there's a journey from God through each crystal sphere, enters a gateway, and depending on the exact position of the interlocking of the crystal spheres, the soul, as it passes through each sphere, gets coated with an aspect of existence related to exactly that relationship between each of the crystal spheres. It gets layers of its soul added as it passes through each that becomes more substantial. So it goes from this infinite thing to being so as it gets more dense, it becomes as it gets more dense and actually contains more matter, it becomes smaller, and then it enters into the human on the earth realm as they take their first breath. And so the soul enters the body. The body interacts with the soul through the spirit. The soul and the body are completely different things, and the spirit is a essence that is like a watery vapor that relates between the body and the soul. So the spirit may have some relationship to what we're referring to as ego in this. And this is yet again another tangent, but one I find interesting in this viewpoint is that when they talked about love sickness back in this time, there was an idea that one's spirit could become so fascinated with another being's body or soul. It's like if you see somebody you think is really fucking amazing and you get obsessed with them, that they believe that your spirit may become so obsessed with the body or the soul, because the spirit can relate to both, of another being, that it loses contact with your own. And your body starts to wither away because it can no longer hear your soul's urging, because the spirit is fixated on someone else's. And that can happen with the ego, of course. But the ego can become obsessed with things or people, and the body can waste away because of that disconnect. Now, the ego... So I brought up this Aristotelian view of the world to illustrate an idea that I've had, I think, before reading about the Aristotelian view of the world, but it gives me a good metaphor, is that this isn't entirely simply true and clear, but in this realm, in the material world, let's say everything can be known in the material world, and science can know it. We can know it. It's not entirely true, but simply, let's say that. Outside of it, if you believe that there is nothing outside of it, then your wondering stops there. Like the material realm, everything that can be known, it can all be known somehow if we build enough spaceships or enough microscopes or submarines, or drills or knives. But then if you get outside of that, then you're like, okay, well, where did I come from right before I came here? And then you make up stories. And this is the power of myth, that you can make up, where was my soul before it came here? What is my soul? What is my soul comprised of? Where's my personality? What is my ego comprised of? What is my body made of? You can come up with all these stories. And this is what I call frame stories, so that there's like a sphere outside of this one that has your frame story in it. And even outside of that, there can be further frame stories. So like I may say like, oh, I'm Dominic. And outside of Dominic, there's like a history of like this soul came here from, let's say there's an ego that has been recycling some energy for a few thousand years or something. So like I make comments now that I believe in reincarnation, which I have for the last 5 years, where I'd say like, oh yes, I've been in India many lives, but not this life, or something like that. That there's a continuous piece of something that relates to this ego that weaves in and out beyond this separate mortality of this Dominic and this body and this thought and the mind and heart. But outside of that frame story, I could believe in a greater archetype, which makes a lot of sense to me. Let's say a less diluted aspect of personality. And put it into any system of 12 you like using, like a Chinese zodiac or a Western zodiac or a Vedic zodiac or the 12 apostles or the Sephiroth, which isn't 12, but you know what I mean. To put it into any system of secondary differentiation from a unified being or a unified system, and say that, okay, so then Dominic is actually an expression of the Gemini archetype. What I know of Dominic is actually an expression of the Gemini archetype. So in any, and this isn't actually how I think about it myself, I'm just trying to make it, think communicable. So that Dominic is an expression of the Gemini archetype. So whenever dealing with Dominic, you're dealing with a higher level, or you're dealing with a lower level of the higher level archetype of Gemini. And so any Gemini you deal with is going to be interacting, or is also interacting with an archetype. So if I'm ever interacting with another Gemini, I can interact with my archetype with them. And that can reflect knowledge, wisdom, integrity in a very unique, in a very specific experience that I wouldn't be able to get with anyone else because we're sharing the same archetype. The same you might say as if you believed in the same God. If you worshiped the same God, then you would be able to step outside of that frame story further into a God realm and be like, well, we're all expressions of that same God or that same angel or that same Deva or that same Bodhisattva. Like, what if I'm, Yama, you can't see any of my Bodhisattvas on the wall right now. I don't know, let's say I'm Manjushri. I like Manjushri. Omarapachana. So let's say that I am a manifestation of Manjushri on a certain level on this plane. And that any other manifestation of Manjushri that I meet, I'm like, we can manifest Manjushri because we are actually the same being through mixed with different things. On this level, we are mixed with different things. So this Dominic is an expression of Manjushri and Gemini and a horse and da-da-da-da. And when I meet this other person who's also an expression of Manjushri, it's also, this one's a female, and this one might be a dragon, this one might be 30 years older than me, this one might be a Sagittarius. But there's a relationship outside of those frame story levels. So that's, when I talk about all this, I really like, getting back to the Buddhism thing and my reactions to it, these ego games, these stories, these understandings of these stories in this realm. Buddhism talks about aspects of existence that I don't hear other people talking about, and I find it very interesting. The dogma of the purity and the evangelical stuff drives me nuts, because I'm just like, I don't want to have to tell your story only, always, forever. I will not sing your ugly song. I will not join your ugly priesthood, to quote a song. And there's an aspect of beauty in it, peace, tranquility, but the idea that it's just suffering all the time and stupid delusion if you're not... but that's the thing. She talked about it in that chapter that I read, was that, you'll always, until you purify your mind, keep coming up with these stories. And a part of me thinks, like, why else are we incarnate as humans if we're not coming up with these stories? I don't want to just erase, rinse the origin and cease to be, as Tricky said. So that is difficult for me to, I don't know if I want to go down the path forever of Buddhism. I'm obviously not that type all the time, but I do feel like I really want to learn the ability to concentrate. It's a bad translation, but the monks at the first retreat I went to talked about how it's a bad translation, but the ability to choose what I'm doing with the mind and body and stick to it is really attractive to me, because I've never been very good at that. I perceive other people think I have a great discipline, but the function of my existence is a mystery and produces a lot of suffering for me. Mystery to me, a lot of suffering for me. If I choose to love someone, this is actually key. If I choose to love someone, I want to love them. I don't want to hate them. And I've noticed that when I love someone, I just tend to hate them. Which I feel I've inherited and been trained in and habitualized. So I would like to purify that out of me, that all of that goes in line with this training. What was the third thing I was going to talk about? The evangelical, the dogma, reaction, the tiredness, the control of one's mind, preciousness, the Dhamma. My oh my, but I can talk a lot. Yeah, I thought this was funny. If the mind remains centered, it cannot make up stories about the injustice of the world or one's friends, or about one's desires or sorrows. All these stories could fill many volumes. I write constantly and I talk constantly, and it's all about my desires and sorrows, really. But isn't that what humanity's about? Or just my humanity? I was talking with someone about this today, a nice old man that I was flirting with on the steps, who was 76. And I was saying that there's a feeling that I've often had in my life, which Buddhism says everyone has, about feeling different. And they say that's just an ego trick, because no one's different. Everyone's suffering in samsara. That's what we're all doing. And yet people often say I'm different, and I often feel different. And when people say, well, you're not actually all that different, then I'm like, okay, how do I not feel all that different? I try to fit in, or I try to not feel alienated, and I just feel alienated and different. And if that's just a function of delusion of ego, then that should be dropped. But then other people say, oh, but you're not like anyone I've ever met. And then they point. And that facilitates my ego. And other people say, well, yes, Dominic, no, we are all in the same boat, but you are closer. You have the ability. You are magic, or you are blah, 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 blah. And although that sounds nice, I don't want to believe that anyone else is stupid or lost or damned to drowning and dissipation. I don't want to believe that. But when I look at, of course, people I interact with, there's just a lot of people that aren't interested in the path that I'm interested in, which of course is not just enlightenment, because I kind of believe that I hate when she's constantly talking about how we're like in this like adult education course. I don't really think it's like that. I kind of think that we all come from being an enlightened being, so we are all an enlightened being. None of us are born stupid, although we're born stupid because we forget everything when we're born, but that's what makes this realm fun. I mean, I kind of think that this is more of an entertainment place than not an entertainment's such a weird word, but that it's an opportunity to have experiences. And Yet there's an aspect to it that it's a trap, because once you get involved in it, you can't get out of it. But that's also inertia and karma, whatever you want to call it. But it's like you're building up worth. I mean, karma is a way of building up worth. And you can imagine it's not just money. You're putting, you're attaching to aspects of existence to keep it all going. And that's precious work. But it's not like it's all evil. And it's not that it's all suffering, because there's a great deal of joy in being attached to someone and loving them and missing them and wanting things to be good for them. The suffering, of course, often happens in the wanting something to be good for someone and wanting someone to want that about oneself as well. And the silly thing is that, of course, there are hundreds of people who want something to be good for us that we probably are just ignoring because it's not fitting into the story. And so then this comes back to me being like, well, then, yeah, I guess I can, relate to this, is that all the suffering just comes from delusion that I'm making up in my mind, or that my mind is making up. It's not that I'm making up. My mind is making up, that's preventing me from being able to be aware of the love that is coming at me. And now I'm just talking in circles. I am very tired, and it's not even like super late by my standards. I think it's still before midnight. I don't know. I'm such a push-pull person. And this triggers me very much in the push-pull of wanting this clarity, wanting this stability. For I am a wanderer in samsara. And I need something good to do with my time. The devil will make work for idle hands to do. So play piano, play beautiful songs, learn how to play pieces, and play them over and over again. Sing a beautiful song. And if you cannot sing your own song, then like the Chinese would say, just keep practicing the masters. Learn to imitate them perfectly. Learn their skills, their feelings, their intentions, their motivations. Then you can connect with your own, with their skill. And I always just keep trying to learn from myself. Will I ever learn? I am not a master. People say I'm a master. I'm not a master. I play one on TV. Okay. Enough. Thank you, Dominic, for taking some time to reflect for yourself and trying to do some good work for yourself and doing it in front of people, because you're in a window of time where you're doing it in front of people. And people, if any of you are there, having a conversation with a person alone in his bedroom at night through the internet, thank you for your audience and compassion.